He said, but tomorrow I feel better. I love them. So. Well, can you get up since you're so old now?
I know.
Did you just have a birthday?
Yes.
She's doing well for what?
Oh, I can't even say it.
You're doing good.
Yes.
You get them to know it. I get in trouble all the time. Yeah. Well, you invited me. You don't remember? Yeah. Are you from Murphy? Been through there a few times. Yeah. Good area. Just passing through.
Yeah, I'm working here today and tomorrow. So I texted Clay. I went to college with Clay. And told him about it. Glad you're here. Thank you. Good to hear.
Next week. I ran down the street and studied about him cooking off.
I got you. I'll go grab that.
That's the business dead. Had to cry. She had 8 o'clock in the morning in Mississippi, and we had to go to Jackson, Tennessee, for the 1 in the afternoon. So, and I took her to school, and then she left out. We're taking her to different companies and support too, to get her there. Hard to navigate, and she didn't know exactly where she's going. And I don't know. I don't have it. Yeah. Yeah, I can't get it to come up on my car screen. I have to look at my phone. I have to pay I'll try to step you before we make her feel rest.
No, I just don't say all the time. I'm here.
And just,
Good, how are you?
I'm actually can say I'm good.
finally learned how to work my phone.
Instead of, oh, I'm making it, oh, I'm here, oh.
Every time I get used to it, it's time to change it, and I have to start all over again. About
Penny,
not worth
Papa,
all.
Penny,
Sometimes I'll just look at that, spend too much time looking at it, and trying to figure it out.
Erica?
Oh, thank you, thank you. But that's so you can see.
Okay.
Otherwise,
How are y'all doing?
fine.
Working. Hey, how are you? Good. Now that when I got back to work, I was like,
I feel for college.
oh. That's all I can think about. They'll be out of town here. Oh, just give it a while. Everything changes. I love gold and white together. Yeah. I think it's so classic. Yeah. It's kind of glamorous. Yeah.
Are you gonna wait till we make?
Oh, I'm done. I'm definitely gonna the name. We need to let you and put in the light. I don't know how that's gonna haven't even. I'm glad to be done. Yeah. And I told
Sounds like a teenager.
I'm not doing anything else intense. She takes too much. Maybe get up in the morning. That is the worst. That is yeah. And you're so rich. Yeah. And then you're waking up drinking coffee. There they are making all this noise. Yes. I'm just glad to have it come in. I remember having to like wash dishes.
No, it's
pictures of Allie food. I bought all this plastic, like, paper plates and cups, and I'm like, if anybody uses this, we're going to take it. I know. Do not use any dishes, real dishes. Yes, everything.
Yes, yes. It's
Silverware,
just
pasta shells, whatever you use.
I know you want to see you here.
Yeah, they're not giving him much time at all. Yeah. Yeah, she's down there.
Tiny, baby. You doing all right?
How was that? I was there for that week. Having the baseball. They didn't win. I did. Amanda remembers it.
So you were there talking trash the whole time? Or do you not talk trash since you guys were all trash?
I didn't have to.
You just have to stick your hand, like, what's the game?
Every, I mean, yeah, I mean, one. They showed up. They were there. They were there.
Oh, these are our first place.
Better than getting knocked out the first round by the Wolves.
It's only one chance.
All right, it's good to see everybody here tonight. Hope you've had a good week. We are finishing up the book of Matthew tonight. Before we begin, let's go to our Father in prayer, and please bow with me, audience. Almighty God, our Father in heaven, we are so thankful for the day, Father. We're thankful for the many wonderful blessings that you bestow upon us, especially now, this time that we have to come together and study your word. Father, be with us as we continue studying about your Son and our Savior, Jesus Christ. We're so thankful for his life, for his example, for his servant attitude, and for his teaching, and for all the wonderful attributes we see in his life every day. Father, help us to emulate that in our lives and be true Christians, followers of Christ each day that we live, Father. Pray all these things through Jesus Christ's name. Amen. So again, this is our last study. Seems like the quarter has gone by really fast. Hopefully you have gleaned a lot from this study. Appreciate Clay teaching. It's good to see Matt out with us. How you feeling, Matty?
Better I deserve.
You can't pop the clutch on that tractor and do wheelies anymore. You can't do that. It's good to have Matt with us. But as we look at, we were actually on Matthew chapter 26 on Sunday. Honestly, I wanted to get through the whole chapter. It's 75 verses. We didn't. We got down to verse 47. So we'll just kind of go through here. I don't really see us getting all the way through, but, this is a lot of meat. One of the things that we talked about was Matthew spends a third of the book on the last week of Jesus' life. 1/3 of his book on the last week of Jesus' life. So obviously it felt like that was important thing to document. And so we want to take the appropriate time with all of that. So we got down, like I said, through verse 47, which now Jesus, he's just gotten through being in the garden. He went through tremendous anguish. He knows what's about to come. And now we see it coming to fruition in verse 47. And we're going to kind of summarize tonight versus reading, because reading is just going to take a long time, but we're going to spend some time on this. We're going to kind of summarize. But 47 through 56, how did Judas identify Jesus to the multitudes? Yeah, with a kiss. Okay, in verse 49, he says, "Greetings, Rabbi," and kissed him. So, verse 47 says, "Great multitudes came with swords and clubs. They came out to Jesus. They came from the chief priests of the elders of the people." Remember in verse 4 or 5 of this chapter that the elders in the multitude, or elders and chief priests, did not want to do this publicly. They wanted more of a, quote, private murder, but now they're taking a very bold stance on coming out in force with power and arresting Jesus. And it's not in this account, or yes, it is in this account. My bad. In verse 51, who cuts off the ear of the servant of the high priest? That's Peter. Yeah, John 18:10-11. And it's interesting that Peter's carrying a sword here. I don't know if maybe the feelings were heightened during this time period. It's also very interesting what Jesus does after that. He puts the man's ear back on. And if you're witnessing that, if you're one of the mob and the multitude, when you see that miracle, does that change your mind at all? It had to be an incredible, you see somebody's ear just cut off and there's got to be a lot of blood, and he just picks it up and puts it right back on without any problem. You kind of look at that and go, man, how is... So, I don't know. That's just something for us to kind of mull on and think about in this situation. But either way, once that happens, Jesus tells disciples, look, put your sword up. This is not a physical battle. He who takes the sword will perish by the sword. And obviously, if it were a physical battle, Jesus would definitely win. He said he would send legions of angels. Do you know how many men are in a legion of soldiers? Anybody want to guess?
500.
Higher.
1,000.
Higher.
25,000.
6,000. There's 6,000 in a legion. And he said he would send 12 legions. So how many is that? Yeah, come on, man. Y'all got 72,000 angels would come down and obviously protect Christ. And when we see in the Old Testament what one angel did to the Babylonian, either Babylonian or Syrians, killing over 100,000 men. So obviously, if it were physical, Jesus wouldn't have any problem. But Jesus says in verse 54 again, how then can the scriptures be fulfilled? So again, it's interesting. Jesus says, look, I was in the temple with you daily. We sat calmly. I taught, and you listened. And now you're coming at me like I'm a criminal. So verse 56, again, all this was done that the scriptures of the prophets might be fulfilled. And it's kind of hard to watch all this, how much of a kangaroo, court trial we're fixing to get into, and how many things were done illegally or just so all this prophecy could be fulfilled. So when this happens, they take Jesus by force. What do the disciples do that are there? Scatter. Okay, what would we do? We're there. We're Jesus' inner circle. We've been with him for these 3 years. We've kind of gone through thick or thin, so to speak. Just in the earlier part of this chapter, he tells Peter he's going to deny. Peter says, no, I'm never going to deny you. And all the disciples agree and say, yes, same here. And literally hours later, they're running. But as we've talked about, it's hard for us to read this and understand what they're seeing here and how they're going through this. If the SWAT team was to show up on our door right now and say, hey, all y'all are studying the Bible, you can't study the Bible or you're going to jail, what do we do? A little different situation, but somewhat of a scenario we can understand until you get in the face of it, you see things in the face, sometimes we react differently. But any comments on that section?
There's a mentality that happens when you get into a crowd. And so there's a mob mentality going on here. And regardless of the fact that they just witnessed this miracle,
they didn't all see it, but the
Right.
ones that were up front certainly did. Regardless of that, the frenzy was already there.
Yeah.
And so nothing that could have been done at that point was gonna deter them from their task.
Well, and I will tell you, and we'll see this later on when Pilate starts asking, you know, who do you want me to release? And we see the chief priests and the Jewish leaders are the ones really whipping this thing into the frenzy. I mean, we're going to see that more as we go along. But, you know, it's interesting. We talked about, you know, Jesus coming into Jerusalem. I think it was in chapter 21, and he finally, you know, they're laying down the palm trees and the clothes, Hosanna and all that. And we say, well, some of those same people could have been, you know, with this mob possibly. That could be true, but I read some information that, hey, those could have been more Galilean-type people in chapter 21, and these are more Jerusalemites, or however you say that, that are being influenced by the leaders. You know, I don't know that. Something, again, that we could probably study these last 3 chapters for another quarter, but just something to think about when you study this whole end-of-life situation for Christ. So 57 through 67 is really Christ on trial here. You got to remember, well, really Jesus is tried 6 times. He goes through Annas, Caiaphas, the Sanhedrin. He goes to Pilate. Pilate sends him back to Herod, and then to Pilate. So you have 3 times tried with Jews, 3 times tried with Rome. So, in the first part of this, in verse 57, Jesus is in front of Caiaphas. He omits the Annas part of this. And who's following at a distance here from Jesus? Peter. You know, say what we want to about Peter, but he shows some very strong courage in different situations. You know, stepping out over the edge of that boat onto the water, that took some courage. You know, we can say, hey, he took his eye off Christ, but he did make a commitment to go out there. He is making a commitment here to even follow behind, in my opinion. There's some exposure there from, or risk from him even doing that. So originally, in this first section, were the Jewish leaders originally able to come up with any credible witnesses? No, they weren't. You know, you can kind of just imagine the scenario where, you know, nothing's working. They're bringing these people up, and then finally in 59 and 60, they have 2 false witnesses that say, hey, I heard this man say, I'm able to destroy the temple of God and build it in 3 days. So Jesus here is still keeping silent. Now, let's think about this for a minute. Well, let me move on for a second. Then the high priest, Caiaphas, he comes out, and you can tell he seems to be a little heightened here at the moment. And he, you know, in verse 63, you know, I'm telling you, Jesus, you're under oath now, and tell us if you are the Son of God. You kind of feel like he's maybe bringing the hammer a little bit on that. And then Jesus confirms that. He says, yes, it is as you say. And nonetheless, after you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power of the coming clouds of heaven. So it's interesting. Had Jesus not been the Son of God, then this would have definitely been blasphemy. But he is the Son of God. Obviously, the Jewish leaders aren't going to believe that ever. But then we see Caiaphas. He tears his clothes, and he says Jesus is deserving of death. So, you know, I don't know what time it was, but obviously this goes on all night. We know Jesus was in the garden praying for a certain period of time. The mob comes after him, arrests him for a certain period of time, and then he goes before all of these particular judges or high priests, so to speak. And so, you know, think about being up all night, number one, from a physical standpoint. Jesus is definitely up all night, but he's not in his bed tossing or turning like we might be. He is, you know, going through an extreme amount of anguish and stress here. So there were multiple judicial laws that were broken here. The Jews weren't allowed to have a capital punishment trial, especially at night. That was completely illegal. Say that right. No death penalty could be pronounced till 3 days later from when the initial judgment comes down. But obviously they fast-tracked all of this. So And then what I find very interesting is the character we see from the Sanhedrin Council and the Jewish leaders in verse 67 and 68. What do they do here? '67 and 68. What do they do? Yeah, I mean, they're spitting on him. They strike him with the palms of their hand, you know, kind of mocking and prophesying, you know, to who struck you. So it's not just some mob. These are the Jewish leaders. So you can imagine, like, our political figures in Memphis or something being in court and getting up and just slapping the witness around. You know, that just shows their character and level of how much they hated Jesus. So it's, when I kind of thought about that, you know, a lot of times we might just read over that because we see how much punishment Jesus is going to take. But when you think about this being the Jewish leaders doing this and stooping to this level of physical abuse on Jesus, I just find that very, very interesting. Any comments on that section, on the trial?
I think they thought they were going to break his spirit of determination
Yeah.
or whatever. But they probably looked at it, he was trying to be stubborn about it or something. But.
Yeah. Very, very, you know, I think Jesus has called them out many times that we've seen, talks about their hearts and the evil in their hearts. And I mean, we've talked about that, and we've made application about that. You know, as we think about our own hearts, you know, we see this type of level of hate. We have to protect our hearts. We make some application on that, putting hedges up, but Jesus says, out of your mouth proceeds, so out of your heart. You know what I'm talking about. I don't have it all together there. Any other comments on that? Okay, let's jump into 27. Again, we see Jesus' arrest and trial lasted throughout the night. Now they send him basically to Pilate for more of a formal hearing. And like we said earlier, that capital punishment charge was more for the Roman government to bring down versus the Jewish leadership. Verses 3 through 10 in chapter 27, we see the death of Judas. So why did Judas regret what he had done?
He realized Jesus was actually going to get killed.
Right.
Verse 4
Yes.
says betrayed. You realize he betrayed him as well.
Yes. Yeah. Seeing Jesus, I think both of those things, he saw that he was condemned, and, you know, that this meant Jesus was going to die. And so he's remorseful. But why did he kill himself instead of seeking forgiveness? Any ideas on that?
I wonder if he didn't think that could not be forgiven.
I would think so. Yeah. Yeah, and I could see him thinking that. I mean, but you may have talked to people in the past and say, look, you know, I've done things that Jesus just can't forgive me of. And, you know, I think we have to explain to them, look, the blood of Jesus Christ is going to forgive any sins. But, you know, 2 Corinthians 7:10, godly sorrow produces repentance, but the sorrow of the world produces death. You know, so I think Judas may have had this feeling of hopelessness that, you know, hey, this is such a huge thing that I've done. Again, I have no hope of ever being forgiven. Yes, sir.
I don't know, but I would speculate. We know Judas spoke money, right? And I'm thinking he saw the miracles that Jesus had done, and he just thought, hey, I'll make a quick buck. And then it was, they actually got Jesus. And then he lost his faith. He was removed. I mean, even the other disciples scattered, and they got away from that. So maybe it was, well, maybe he's not coming back. Didn't have that full picture, and so he couldn't live with himself, you know, for that. I mean, even John the Baptist said, you know, when he was in prison, right, something to the effect of, you really are who you say you were, right? Just there was that, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief,
right?
Type thing,
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I mean, we could probably contemplate Judas in his heart and his life, you know, just kind of looking at his whole situation, but
Maybe he thought he was next.
maybe he thought he was next. I don't know, but I do think, quote, seeing Jesus in my analogy in handcuffs really hit home to him, like you said, yes.
This is also speculation, but
Yeah.
from the history that we know, the age of people that were normally accumulated by rabbis, their students, their disciples, were almost always teenagers. That's just the age group that was taken in as students.
Yeah.
It's very likely that these were very young men. I mean, Peter, he wouldn't write Second Peter for another 30 years. So he's probably in his 20s, maybe he's still a teenager. Judas, likewise, was also very young. And I think that just gives a little bit of nuance and maybe just understanding of this impetuousness and just, oh yeah, I'm going to go spend a bunch of money. I'm going to go make greed. And it's, you know, it's an immaturity that he never got to a point where he was able to both physically mature and spiritually mature.
Yeah, good observation. Yeah, that could be part of it as well.
Yeah, I think verse 3 kind of says something important. It says, then Judas, his betrayer, seeing that he had been condemned.
Yeah.
He knows he's going to be put to death. That what his action has led to something. And for anybody who has ever done anything in your life that you know somebody has messed up on, and you can put that in any bubble, right? And if you talk to anybody who has ever been responsible for somebody else's death, they can't live with that.
Yeah.
And this is innocent blood.
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly.
So think about it. We live in a day and time when we're messed up and we're kind of desensitized to a lot of things. He knows that he is very much the cause of how they got to him. And he's going to be condemned. And he's sitting here, he's messed up. And he tried to remedy the situation. Here's the silver, I messed up, I betrayed innocent blood. Can't put the genie back in the bottle, right?
They're like, what is that to us? Yeah, they're like, what is that to us?
Right, yeah. Too bad, you did your part and we don't care. And now all of a sudden, what do you do with that? How do you return from that? And I think he did what most carnal-minded people do, just feel like you have no hope.
Yeah. Yeah.
Why do they highlight the coins so much?
Why do they highlight the coins?
Yeah.
We're fulfilling prophecy here from Zechariah 11 and verse 9. This is what they do with the coins. They go out and buy a potter's field, which is really just a place to bury people who don't have a place to be buried. They did not think it would be lawful to put it back in the treasury, so they knew that it was, quote, blood money. So that's just my initial off-the-cuff answer to that. But
and then also, when they're talking about the piece of silver, it could just be for us, too, to understand that it wasn't really that much money.
Right.
You know?
Yeah. We talked about that on
If
Sunday.
we were thinking, oh, it was a whole bunch of
Right.
money, it would make a difference in our minds that it was really not much. He did it for
About a month's wage, yeah.
Yeah, for such a little thing.
All right, so then we see 11 through 26. Jesus is going to go before Pilate here. And Pilate jumps right in on him and says, hey, are you the king of the Jews? And Pilate was asking more from a political standpoint. He's not really worried about a religious type thing. His job, Pilate's job, would have been more, to keep tabs on any type of revolutionaries. It's also, what I dug up was, a lot of people said it's very probable that Pilate knew of Jesus. He had heard of him, and knew that Jesus didn't have, troops or weapons or money, and knew that, from a military standpoint, that Jesus was not going to be a threat to Rome at all. But why did Pilate marvel when Jesus refused to answer his accusers? They're blasting him with all this stuff, saying, look, he said this, he's a blasphemer, and
They probably thought he would cave in.
could be. I think Pilate is just kind of amazed at how Jesus is acting and the fact that he's not really trying to defend himself. Think about it. In our jobs, maybe, if we get accused of doing something wrong or doing something that messed up something, what do? Not say anything? No. I mean, we're like, hey, but you're going back in emails and you're saying, look, I did this, I did that.
Yep.
You're trying to, protect yourself. And Jesus is definitely doing what probably Pilate had not seen before. And in my opinion, I'm sure Jesus is handling himself, you know, with wisdom and self-control. And by not saying anything, Pilate is definitely amazed at that. But again, as Matthew does, this is another prophecy that we're fulfilling from Isaiah 53 verse 7. As a sheep before his shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. So there's that aspect of it as well. In verse 15, we see there's a feast in which it's customary for the governor that would release one prisoner to the multitude. And I think it's obvious that Pilate at this point, he knows the Jewish leaders are really trying to kill Jesus here for no reason. He's not guilty. They know there's envy involved. Pilate knows there's envy. And I think the book asks a good question. It says, what is it about each of these people that made Pilate want to release Jesus? What was it about the Jewish leaders that made him want to release Jesus?
He didn't like the Jewish leaders.
Yeah, there was definitely, he didn't care about their religious things, and he was having to, they were having to get along. But like I said, Pilate knew they had envy, strong envy against Jesus, and knew they were just trying to kill him. What about Pilate's wife?
Had the dream and said, don't have anything to do with him.
Yeah, so you got the leaders, the wife, and then what we said about Jesus would be the final one. He just marveled at his demeanor and his behavior and not answering these charges. So I think he sees all of that, and he's like, I think Pilate, and then he even goes a step further and goes, hey, who do you want me to release, Barabbas or Jesus? He gives them a choice. And, had the Jewish leaders not stirred up the crowd in verse 20, but the chief priests and the elders persuaded the multitude that they should ask for Barabbas and destroy Jesus. I think if that wouldn't have happened, if you took that verse out, I think most people probably would have said release Jesus. Pilate was definitely hoping for that as well. But we know the chief priests and the elders, they're not going to leave anything to chance here. They're going to make sure that those nails are being firmly nailed in the coffin of Jesus.
Rob, do you notice how many times God gave them a way out? Wife has a vision. Man, leave that man alone.
Yeah.
Why do you guys want Barabbas? He hasn't done. This other guy hasn't done anything. If Satan would have knew what was getting ready to happen, he would have protected Christ by all means, because he didn't even understand that death was about to be conquered. And just think if he really would have understood what was happening. But instead, could you imagine him thinking, man, I'm winning, look at this, this is great. And all of a sudden, after day 3, it's going to be a uh-oh.
Yeah.
And that's too, on Jesus didn't say anything. He was doing
Of course. Yeah, absolutely. That's the big part of it.
Stayed up all night.
Right. Yes.
It's also possible that Barabbas was the third guy on the cross. One of the three guys being crucified. Possible. And Jesus took his place. That's kind of an illustration. Possibly. It doesn't say that, but that's something we talked about before. Terry preached a lesson on that years ago. But
I remember that.
Possibility.
Yeah. Well, as we talked about that, we get down to verse 22, and it's interesting. Why does Pilate ask this question? What shall I do with Jesus? Why did he ask that? Who's in control here? Is it the multitude that's in control, or is it Pilate that's in charge?
He's trying to put the blame on them, like in verse 24. It's on you guys.
Yeah, exactly. He wants to get out from under it, but it's just interesting that, he still had the opportunity here to let Jesus go. Just because Barabbas was released didn't mean that he had to crucify Jesus. I mean, think about that. He didn't have to crucify Jesus.
You were scared that he would be the next one if he didn't fall for him.
Well,
the crowds were definitely unruly.
Well, and that's what we're going to get to, yeah. Again, Pilate tried to release him. He sends him to Herod. Remember that? Luke's account, I find no fault in him. He's innocent. Luke's account again says he's done nothing worthy of death. He proposed a choice between Christ and Barabbas. Verse 23, why? What evil has he done? The Luke account said, I will therefore chastise him and release him. So, hey, I'm just going to, give him a whip, and then let him go. But they weren't having any of that. How did they respond to Pilate in verse 23? Yeah, I mean, you can tell, like it says, there's a tumult, getting ready, a mob, they have that mentality. Now, I think, the Roman government, they want two things. Any idea?
Power and money.
They want those taxes to keep coming in. That's first and foremost. The other thing is, in any province, they want peace. They don't want any mob mentality. So Pilate's starting to see what's happening here, and he knows he's kind of getting back into a corner. So John 19 account finally says, if you remember, they say, the Jewish leaders say, look, if you let this man go, you are not Caesar's friend. Whoever makes himself a king speaks against Caesar. So that would have really hit Pilate in the face of, hey, you're betraying Caesar. You're not a friend of Caesar if you let this man go. So if you're Pilate, you can relate to that. You can say kind of like, wow.
He didn't want that to get back.
He didn't want that to get back. And, that probably started the wheels turning of, man, I'm not going to be able to get out of this. And he realizes that. And verse 24, when Pilate saw he could not prevail at all, but rather a tumult was rising, he took water and washed his hands before the multitude, saying, I'm innocent of the blood of this just person. So why did he think that? I mean, is he innocent? Does he have no responsibility? Absolutely not. There was a law in the Old Testament. I didn't research it. It was something if innocent blood or somebody did get murdered, the leaders of the town or the chief priest had to sacrifice a cow, and then all the leaders would come in and wash their hands in the holy place. But that was after the person had already been killed. In this situation, Pilate still had the opportunity to stop this or release Jesus. But obviously we see the pressure, and he moves forward with it.
He was probably looking at it too, that these people, Christ came from these people. He was, they looked at him as a Jew, didn't they? So,
yeah.
And his leaders are wanting him killed, so he's like, what difference, I can't do anything about that.
Yeah. Well, if you do research on Pilate, and I don't know, after all of this, his career tanks after this. If you go back and do research, he gets demoted, so to speak, and then goes to some other areas, and eventually, the rest of his, quote, career is not good. But what do the people say in verse 25?
His blood be on us and on our children.
Yeah, think about saying that, when you're in this multitude, and again, I do think there is a mob mentality here. I don't know how many people are here at this particular trial, so to speak. We know the estimates are anywhere from 1 to 2 million people would come to Passover to Jerusalem at that time. So how many of those people were here, I don't know. But for them to say, hey, it's on us, his blood is on us and our children. And I think this means, it's on the Jewish nation, those people of that time and their children, which we see in Acts where Peter reminds them of this. In Acts 2 and Acts 3, he says, look, you're guilty of the blood of Jesus. Obviously in Pentecost, we see that's what drives people to, the huge baptism in the beginning of the church there.
Well,
in
you can
Acts 2.
understand that some of those people had heard Jesus' sermons before that, so he knew this was going to happen. He was trying to tell his apostles that was going to happen, and so. Yeah,
I think that prophecy, we see it all through, and Jesus, right. I just don't know if they actually, they obviously didn't realize that at the time. We have the benefit of hindsight and looking back.
Peter didn't. He was trying to fight with it, fight
right.
it off.
Yeah, he was like, it's not going to happen. Yeah, so, any comments on that section? Yes.
I think there are so many parallels in this chapter specifically to the story of Joseph. And I think that to a Jewish audience that would have really been very apparent. You talk about the silver and being betrayed by brothers, being sold, in the first part of the chapter by Judas. And then this emphasis over and over and over about innocence and how Joseph was continually proven innocent in all of these things he was accused of. He never got a chance to try to redeem himself or justify himself. He just was consistently innocent. Same thing with Jesus, where he's proven innocent before these people. He's proven innocent before Pilate. Pilate's wife says that he's innocent, which is kind of an interesting parallel to Potiphar's wife saying that he wasn't innocent.
Yeah.
And then here in verse 25, his blood be on us and our children. And these people speaking this almost prophecy in a sense without even intending it. They intended this for evil. They intended this for bad. Just like Joseph's brothers did. They intended his blood being spilt to be an evil thing, to be vengeance, because they were envious. But instead, God used that for good, for the saving of them and all of their children. So when they say, let this blood be on us, they meant that for evil. But Jesus turns that into good and says, this blood is going to be on you, and it's going to save you.
Yeah, good point. That's probably a sermon in there somewhere.
Yeah, I was thinking that was preached.
Yeah, there's probably a sermon in there for sure on that comparison, yeah. Okay, so we see that in verse 25, Pilate released Barabbas to them, and when he had scourged Jesus, he delivered him to be crucified. And so, and we're not going to dive deep into this. Certainly, we're all aware of, how brutal and torturous this whole process was, but it's almost like, we just kind of read over that whole scourging Jesus and delivered him to be crucified. But, that was just, if you read any type of history on scourging, it was just a horrible, brutal process where some of the men didn't even make it through that. You're strapped to a big rock or a column. There's no limit on how many strokes you get. Yes.
I'm just going to say, was that a custom to do before everyone was crucified, or was this just something that they did? Did he hope Jesus would die during this instead, or why?
Because what's the point if you're saying this man's innocent?
Right.
Why scourge him?
Yeah.
Right? Unless you're going to try to beat the sense out of him so that he doesn't have to go through all the other. Because I've always struggled with this one, right? It's either he did it for that sake, or he did it to hope, in my mind, to hope that they would see him bloody and beat up, and
say
they would
no.
just say that, yeah.
Yeah. I've seen that.
I don't even
too.
understand why you would do that after you said, hey, his blood's not on my hand.
Yeah.
Aren't we told that in another gospel, that he thought that would satisfy them?
I don't know
I thought I
exactly.
made that up in my head.
Yeah, I don't know where I read that before. I thought that he might see that how bad the punishment of scourging was, and they might relent a little bit. But of course, we know the story. They don't. Then verse 27 on, we see here, there's just, we can't imagine in what shape Jesus is in at this point. But now they take, the soldiers take him into the praetorium, which the praetorium was kind of like the governor's, inner court, or it could be part of his house or some type of inner area. And then you have a whole garrison of soldiers around him. A garrison, I've read, is anywhere from 100 to 300, soldiers. And, you think about that. It wasn't like it was just 4 or 5 guys around him, apparently. If it is the whole garrison, like it says, think about, you're in a locker room with, 10 football teams, the guys, and they're sitting there spitting on you, slapping you. They strip you down, and, you're probably literally half dead, and, you get humiliated like this, spat on, struck, you're mocked. Again, we just cannot imagine the suffering and the mental aspect of it, the emotional aspect of it, the degrading, of a man that is 100% innocent and sin-free. So,
But yet, that's what we see mobs do. When we've seen even
Yeah.
today, when a mob gets started, it's like, that person becomes inhuman, and they just
Yeah,
because it's the thing to do.
yeah, I read, this wasn't the mob, but this was the soldiers of the Roman soldiers, and I've read this is just like another day at the office for them, based on what they did to criminals. I mean, this was just part of the process. and they, probably didn't lose a minute of sleep over it. It's just how, harsh they had become, and just what they do. That's in your scope of work as a centurion, or a soldier. And you do that, and it just, I don't know, but, anyway, verse 35, we see another prophecy fulfilled from Psalms 22. They divided my garments among them, and for my clothes they cast lots. They make Jesus, carry the cross. Obviously, he wasn't strong enough to do that. Simon comes in and fulfills that role.
And why couldn't the soldiers do? Why they had to get this guy?
Well, the soldiers aren't going to carry his cross. Yeah, I mean, that's something they're definitely not going to do.
It was John 19:2, Megan, you're right, 2 through 6. John 19, verse 2.
That says that?
Yeah, basically his whole scourging point was so that he found no fault that they could see, and they're like, yeah, our custom is someone should die. Kill him, crucify him.
So, we see Jesus go out, they crucify him, he's got 2 robbers on either side of him, and not only do we have, again, here we see the character of the chief priests and scribes in verse 41 and 42. They're mocking Jesus. Again, these are the officials, the leaders of Israel. Just can't imagine their behavior. They're showing their true colors. They're saying, hey, if you come down from the cross, then, they said, if you come down from the cross, we'll believe you. Would they, even if he would have done that, would they believe him? No, of course not. So, ironically, if he did come down from the cross, then none of their sins would be forgiven. I mean, you get the whole connection. It's all related. But certainly they wouldn't believe him, but we know Christ is going to do even a more miraculous thing when he comes forth from the tomb in 3 days, the tomb that was sealed. So even the robbers on either side join in on the taunting here of Jesus. So it's hard to imagine, this scene, even reading it. And I think a lot of times we've read it so many times as Christians that we don't put the emphasis on kind of really slowing down and just trying to get in somebody's shoes that's witnessing this whole thing. It's what?
Mother.
Yeah, all these, your families from a distance, it had to be tremendously painful for them to see this.
I have to wonder, though, the people that he did miracles on and that he healed.
Yeah.
Made men walk who couldn't walk, and rose people from the dead, and blind men. I mean, just, is he looking, into this audience, and does he see them there? Who knows if they're there or not, but that has to be so just messed up.
Yeah.
Here I've done this for you, and, you have nothing to say, nothing. Not just them, but the apostles as well. I mean,
right.
I think that to me would hurt.
Yeah, that's one of the replays when I'm in heaven I don't know that I'll want to see, I know it happened, I'm good with it, I'm extremely thankful that it happened, but I'm just not sure. Then you have all these other events starting in verse 45. From the 6th hour to the 9th hour, what happened? There's darkness, 12 noon to 3 p.m. in the middle of the day. It's darkness. And then, no, this was not an eclipse like happened a month ago. It lasted way too long for that. It wasn't a dust storm. It wasn't fog. It wasn't some natural phenomenon. We know this is a divine situation here. In verse 46, we see Jesus cry out, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? Another quote from Psalms 22. Did the Father forsake Jesus?
No.
Why not? Or how?
If you continue to read Psalms, it breaks that whole thing down.
Yeah. The Father doesn't stop the suffering. He lets the sacrifice happen, but he is still with Jesus from a standpoint of being there. But he doesn't obviously stop the suffering that Jesus is going through for the sins of mankind. And Jesus doesn't stop it. We know he had the power to come off the cross. And thank goodness he didn't. So that had to be from the Godhead standpoint, a very challenging time. I don't know if that's the right word, but their ways are higher than my ways. I don't go in that court. But then we see Jesus in verse 50. He cries out again, and he yielded up the Spirit. So their work is done. At this point in the chapter, there's kind of this, the way I read this, especially in Matthew, there's kind of this real dark cloud, almost literally and figuratively, as you get to this point where Jesus dies. And then what happens after he dies? What do we see? What are the events that happen? The veil was torn in two from top to bottom. What's the significance of that?
Couldn't be done by man.
Yep. We don't need that high priest anymore. We go directly to God through Jesus now. Jesus is our high priest. The earthquake, rock splitting, the graves were open, and many bodies of the saints who fallen asleep were raised. And this says in verse 53, you got to catch that, this happened, the bodies were raised after the resurrection, after his resurrection. They went into the holy city and appeared to many. And I just wonder, what if your grandmother, your mother, comes back to you or comes in the city and you see them? How did that work? Were they of their, did they just pick up where they left off? Again, that's a good question to ask when you get to heaven right there. How did that work? How would that impact our faith, etc.? So, thank you for all your comments. Hopefully we've all learned something this quarter, and appreciate everybody being here.
That's why somebody called that.
Movie where some guy was after a kid, and he's pulling a big, huge he falls on the tractor. Isn't there any safety? Is there any? I mean, I don't know. If you're wearing one of those cords that shuts the motor off, that's probably what you need to be doing. Safety in that scenario. I can't remember what movie.
I stopped and I turned off.
So yeah, that was all off. Yeah. But this kid was messing around. He was like trying to hit it, grab something off a tree, and then he just falls off and just up, man. Because you don't realize how heavy all that stuff is, man. It's your first, implement.